Leadership, 6 Studies in World Strategy. By Henry Kissinger. Introduction. 1. The Axes of Leadership. 2. The Nature of Leadership Decisions. 3.6 Leaders in their context. 4. Epitomes of leadership, the statesman and the prophet. 5. The individual in history. Introduction. The Axes of Leadership. Any society, whatever its political system, is perpetually in transit between a past that forms its memory and a vision of the future that inspires its evolution. Along this route, leadership is indispensable. Decisions must be made, trust earned, promises kept, a way forward proposed. Within human institutions, states, religions, armies, companies, schools, leadership is needed to help people reach from where they are to where they have never been and, sometimes, can scarcely imagine going. Without leadership, institutions drift, and nations court growing irrelevance and, ultimately, disaster. Leaders think and act at the intersection of 2 axes, the first, between the past and the future, the second, between the abiding values and aspirations of those they lead. Their first challenge is analysis, which begins with a realistic assessment of their society based on its history, mores, and capacities. Then they must balance what they know, which is necessarily drawn from the past, with what they intuit about the future, which is inherently conjectural and uncertain. It is this intuitive grasp of direction that enables leaders to set objectives and lay down a strategy. For strategies to inspire the society, leaders must serve as educators, communicating objectives, assuaging doubts, and rallying support. While the state possesses by definition the monopoly of force, reliance on coercion is a symptom of inadequate leadership. Good leaders elicit in their people a wish to walk alongside them. They must also inspire an immediate entourage to translate their thinking so that it bears upon the practical issues of the day. Such a dynamic surrounding team is the visible complement of the leader's inner vitality. It provides support for the leader's journey and ameliorates the dilemmas of decision. Leaders can be magnified, or diminished, by the qualities of those around them. The vital attributes of a leader in these tasks, and the bridge between the past and the future, are courage and character. Courage to choose a direction among complex and difficult options, which requires the willingness to transcend the routine, and strength of character to sustain a course of action whose benefits and whose dangers can be only incompletely glimpsed at the moment of choice. Courage summons virtue in the moment of decision. Character reinforces fidelity to values over an extended period. Leadership is most essential during periods of transition, when values and institutions are losing their relevance, and the outlines of a worthy future are in controversy. In such times, leaders are called upon to think creatively and diagnostically. What are the sources of the society's well-being? Of its decay? Which inheritances from the past should be preserved, and which adapted or discarded? Which objectives deserve commitment, and which prospects must be rejected no matter how tempting? And, at the extreme, is one's society sufficiently vital and confident to tolerate sacrifice as a way station to a more fulfilling future? The nature of leadership decisions. Leaders are inevitably hemmed in by constraints. They operate in scarcity, for every society faces limits to its capabilities and reach, dictated by demography and economy. They also operate in time, for every era and every culture reflects its own prevailing values, habits, and attitudes that together define its desired outcomes. And leaders operate in competition, for they must contend with other players, whether allies, potential partners, or adversaries, who are not static but adaptive, with their own distinct capacities and aspirations. Moreover, events often move too quickly to allow for precise calculation. Leaders have to make judgments based on intuitions and hypotheses that cannot be proven at the time of decision. Management of risk is as critical to the leader as analytical skill. Strategy describes the conclusion a leader reaches under these conditions of scarcity, temporality, competition, and fluidity. In finding the way ahead, strategic leadership may be likened to traversing a tightrope. Just as an acrobat will fall if either too timid or too audacious, a leader is obliged to navigate within a narrow margin, suspended between the relative certainties of the past and the ambiguities of the future. The penalty for excessive ambition, what the Greeks called hubris, is exhaustion, while the price for resting on one's laurels is progressive insignificance and eventual decay. Step by step, leaders must fit means to ends and purpose to circumstance if they are to reach their destinations. The leader as strategist faces an inherent paradox. In circumstances that call for action, the scope for decision making is often greatest when relevant information is at its scantiest. By the time more data become available, the margin of maneuver tends to have narrowed. Amid the early phases of a rival power's strategic arms buildup, for example, or in the sudden appearance of a novel respiratory virus, the temptation is to regard the emerging phenomenon as either transitory or manageable by established standards. By the time the threat can no longer be denied or minimized, the scope for action will have constricted or the cost of confronting the problem may have grown exorbitant. Misuse time, and limits will begin to impose themselves. Even the best of the remaining choices will be complex to execute, with reduced rewards for success and graver risks in failure. This is when the leader's instinct and judgment are essential. Winston Churchill understood it well when he wrote in The Gathering Storm, 1948, "Statesmen are not called upon only to settle easy questions. These often settle themselves. It is where the balance quivers, and the proportions are veiled in mist, that the opportunity for world-saving decisions presents itself." In May 1953, an American exchange student asked Churchill how one might prepare to meet the challenges of leadership. "Study history. Study history," was Churchill's emphatic reply. "In history lie all the secrets of statecraft." Churchill was himself a prodigious student and writer of history who well understood the continuum within which he was working. But knowledge of history, while essential, is not sufficient. Some issues remain forever veiled in mist, forbidding even to the erudite and experienced. History teaches by analogy, through the ability to recognize comparable situations. Its lessons, however, are in essence approximations which leaders are tested to recognize and are responsible for adapting to the circumstances of their own time. The early 20th century philosopher of history Oswald Spengler captured this task when he described the born leader as, above all, a valuer of men, situations, and things, with the ability to do the correct thing without knowing it. Strategic leaders need also the qualities of the artist who senses how to sculpt the future using the materials available in the present. As Charles de Gaulle observed in his meditation on leadership, The Edge of the Sword, 1932, the artist does not renounce the use of his intelligence, which is, after all, the source of lessons, methods, and knowledge. Instead, the artist adds to these foundations a certain instinctive faculty which we call inspiration, which alone can provide the direct contact with nature from which the vital spark must leap. Because of the complexity of reality, truth in history differs from truth in science. The scientist seeks verifiable results. The historically informed strategic leader strives to distill actionable insight from inherent ambiguity. Scientific experiments support or cast doubt on previous results, presenting scientists with the opportunity to modify their variables and repeat their trials. Strategists are usually permitted only one test. Their decisions are typically irrevocable. The scientist thus learns truth experimentally or mathematically. The strategist reasons at least partly by analogy with the past, first establishing which events are comparable and which prior conclusions remain relevant. Even then, the strategist must choose analogies carefully, for no one can, in any real sense, experience the past. One can only imagine it as if, by the moonlight of memory, in the phrase of the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga. Meaningful political choices rarely involve a single variable. Wise decisions require a composite of political, economic, geographical, technological, and psychological insights, all informed by an instinct for history. Writing at the end of the 20th century, Isaiah Berlin described the impossibility of applying scientific thinking beyond its remit and, consequently, the enduring challenge of the strategist's craft. He held that the leader, like the novelist or landscape painter, must absorb life in all its dazzling complexity. What makes men foolish or wise, understanding or blind, as opposed to knowledgeable or learned or well-informed, is the perception of the unique flavors of each situation as it is, in its specific differences, of that in it wherein it differs from all other situations, that is, those aspects of it which make it insusceptible to scientific treatment. 6 leaders in their context. It is the combination of character and circumstance which creates history, and the 6 leaders profiled in these pages, Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, Richard Nixon, Anwar Sadat, Lee Kuan Yew and Margaret Thatcher, were all shaped by the circumstances of their dramatic historical period. They all then also became architects of the post-war evolution of their societies and the international order. I had the good fortune to encounter all 6 at the height of their influence and to work intimately with Richard Nixon. Inheriting a world whose certainties had been dissolved by war, they redefined national purposes, opened up new vistas and contributed a new structure to a world in transition. Each of the 6 leaders, in his or her way, passed through the fiery furnace of the Second 30 Years' War, that is, the series of destructive conflicts stretching from the beginning of the First World War in August 1914, to the end of the Second World War in September 1945. Like the First 30 Years' War, the Second began in Europe but bled into the larger world. The first transformed Europe from a region where legitimacy was derived from religious faith and dynastic inheritance, to an order based on the sovereign equality of secular states and bent on spreading its precepts around the globe. 3 centuries later, the Second 30 Years' War challenged the entire international system to overcome disillusionment in Europe and poverty, in much of the rest of the world with new principles of order. Europe had entered the 20th century at the peak of its global influence, imbued with the conviction that its progress over the previous centuries was certain, if not destined, to be unending. The continent's populations and economies were growing at an unprecedented rate. Industrialization and increasingly free trade had midwifed historic prosperity. Democratic institutions existed in nearly every European country, dominant in Britain and France. They were underdeveloped but gaining in relevance in Imperial Germany and Austria, and incipient in pre-revolutionary Russia. The educated classes of early 20th century Europe shared with Lodovico Settembrini, the liberal humanist in Thomas Mann's novel The Magic Mountain, the faith that things were taking a course favorable to civilization. This utopian view reached its apotheosis in the English journalist Norman Angell's best-selling 1910 treatise The Great Illusion, which held that growing economic interdependence among the European powers had rendered war prohibitively expensive. Angel proclaimed, man's irresistible drift away from conflict and towards cooperation. This and many other comparable predictions would be exploded in short order, perhaps most notably Engel's claim that it was no longer possible for any government to order the extermination of a whole population, of the women and children. In the old biblical style, the First World War exhausted treasuries, terminated dynasties, and shattered lives. It was a catastrophe from which Europe has never fully recovered. By the signing of the Armistice Agreement on November 11, 1918, nearly 10 million soldiers and 7 million civilians had been killed. 10 of every 7 soldiers who had been mobilized, 1 never returned. 2 generations of the youth of Europe had been depleted, young men killed, young women left widowed or alone, countless children orphaned. While France and Britain emerged victorious, both were exhausted and politically fragile. Defeated Germany, shorn of its colonies and gravely indebted, oscillated between resentment of the victors and internal conflict among its competing political parties. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires both collapsed, while Russia experienced one of the most radical revolutions in history and now stood outside any international system. During the interwar years, democracies faltered, totalitarianism marched, and privation stalked the continent. The martial enthusiasms of 1914 having long since subsided, Europe greeted the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 with premonition tinged with resignation. And, this time, the world at large shared in Europe's suffering. From New York, the Anglo-American poet W. H. Auden would write, "Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night." Auden's words proved prescient. The human toll exacted by the Second World War ran to no fewer than 60 million lives, primarily concentrated in the Soviet Union, China, Germany, and Poland. By August 1945, from Cologne and Coventry to Nanjing and Nagasaki, cities had been reduced to rubble through shelling, aerial bombing, fire and civil conflict. The shattered economies, widespread famine and exhausted populations left in the war's wake were daunted by the costly tasks of national reconstitution. Germany's national standing, almost its very legitimacy, had been obliterated by Adolf Hitler. In France, the Third Republic had collapsed under the impact of the Nazi assault of 1940 and was, by 1944, only just beginning its recovery from that moral void. Of the major European powers, Great Britain alone had preserved its pre-war political institutions, but it was effectively bankrupt and would soon have to deal with the progressive loss of its empire and persistent economic distress. On each of the 6 leaders profiled in this book, these upheavals left an indelible mark. The political career of Konrad Adenauer, born 1876, who served as mayor of Cologne from 1917 to 1933, would include the interwar conflict with France over the Rhineland as well as the rise of Hitler during the Second World War. He was twice imprisoned by the Nazis. Beginning in 1949, Adenauer shepherded Germany past the lowest point of its history by abandoning its decades-long quest for domination of Europe, anchoring Germany in the Atlantic Alliance, and rebuilding it on a moral foundation which reflected his own Christian values and democratic convictions. Charles de Gaulle, born 1890, spent 2.5 years during the First World War as a prisoner of war in Wilhelmine, Germany. In the Second, he initially commanded a tank regiment. Then, after the collapse of France, he rebuilt the political structure of France twice, the first time in 1944 to restore France's essence, and the second time in 1958 to revitalize its soul and prevent civil war. De Gaulle guided France's historical transition from a defeated, divided, and overstretched empire to a stable, prosperous nation-state under a sound constitution. From that basis, he restored France to a significant and sustainable role in international relations. Richard Nixon, born 1913, took from his experience in the Second World War the lesson that his country had to play an enhanced role in the emerging world order. Despite being the only U.S. president to resign from office, between 1969 and 1974 he modified the superpower tensions of the High Cold War, and led the United States out of the conflict in Vietnam. In the process, he put American foreign policy on a constructive global footing by opening relations with China, beginning a peace process that would transform the Middle East and emphasizing a concept of world order based on equilibrium. Two of the leaders discussed in these pages experienced the Second World War as colonial subjects. Anwar Sadat, born 1918, as an Egyptian army officer, was imprisoned for 2 years for attempting in 1942 to collaborate with German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in expelling the British from Egypt, and then for 3 years, much of it in solitary confinement, after the assassination of the pro-British former finance minister Amin Osman. Long animated by revolutionary and pan-Arab convictions, Sadat was projected, in 1970, by the sudden death of Gamal Abdel Nasser into the presidency of an Egypt that had been shocked and demoralized by defeat in the 1967 war with Israel. Through an astute combination of military strategy and diplomacy, he then endeavored to restore Egypt's lost territories and self-confidence while securing long-elusive peace with Israel, with a transcendent philosophy. Lee Kuan Yew, born 1923, narrowly escaped execution by the occupying Japanese in 1942. Lee shaped the evolution of an impoverished, multi-ethnic port city at the edge of the Pacific, surrounded by hostile neighbors. Under his tutelage, Singapore emerged as a secure, well-administered and prosperous city-state with a shared national identity providing unity amid cultural diversity. Margaret Thatcher, born 1925, huddled with her family around the radio listening to Prime Minister Winston Churchill's wartime broadcasts during the Battle of Britain. In 1979, Thatcher inherited in Britain a former imperial power permeated by an air of weary resignation over the loss of its global reach and the decline of its international significance. She renewed her country through economic reform and a foreign policy that balanced boldness with prudence. From the Second 30 Years' War, all 6 leaders drew their own conclusions as to what had led the world astray, alongside a vivid appreciation of the indispensability of bold and aspirational political leadership. The historian Andrew Roberts reminds us that, although the most common understanding of leadership connotes inherent goodness, leadership is in fact completely morally neutral, as capable of leading mankind to the abyss as to the sunlit uplands. It is a protean force of terrifying power that we must strive to orient toward moral ends. Epitomes of leadership, the statesman and the prophet. Most leaders are not visionary but managerial. In every society and at every level of responsibility, day-to-day stewards are needed to guide the institutions entrusted to their care. But during periods of crisis, whether of war, rapid technological change, jarring economic dislocation or ideological upheaval, management of the status quo may be the riskiest course of all. In fortunate societies, such times call forth transformational leaders. Their distinction can be categorized into 2 ideal types, the statesman and the prophet. Far-sighted statesmen understand that they have a pair of essential tasks. The first is to preserve their society by manipulating circumstances rather than being overwhelmed by them. Such leaders will embrace change and progress, while ensuring that their society retains its basic sense of itself through the evolutions they encourage within it. The second is to temper vision with wariness, entertaining a sense of limits. Such leaders assume responsibility not only for the best but also for the worst outcomes. They tend to be conscious of the many great hopes that have failed, the countless good intentions that could not be realized, the stubborn persistence in human affairs of selfishness and power hunger and violence. In that definition of leadership, statesmen are inclined to erect hedges against the possibility that even the most well-made plans might prove abortive, or that the most eloquent formulation might hide ulterior motives. They tend to be suspicious of those who personalize policy, for history teaches the fragility of structures dependent largely on single personalities. Ambitious but not revolutionary, they work within what they perceive as the grain of history, moving their societies forward while viewing their political institutions and fundamental values as an inheritance to be transmitted to future generations, albeit with modifications that sustain their essence. Wise leaders in the statesman mode will recognize when novel circumstances require existing institutions and values to be transcended, but they understand that, for their societies to thrive, they will have to ensure that change does not go beyond what it can sustain. Such statesmen include the 17th-century leaders, who fashioned the Westphalian state system, as well as 19th-century European leaders such as Palmerston, Gladstone, Disraeli, and Bismarck. In the 20th century, Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and Jawaharlal Nehru were all leaders in the statesman mode. The second type of leader, that of the visionary, or prophet, treats prevailing institutions less from the perspective of the possible than from a vision of the imperative. Prophetic leaders invoke their transcendent visions as proof of their righteousness. Craving an empty canvas on which to lay down their designs, they take as a principal task the erasure of the past, its treasures along with its snares. The virtue of prophets is that they redefine what appears possible. They are the unreasonable men, to whom George Bernard Shaw credited all progress. Believing in ultimate solutions, prophetic leaders tend to distrust gradualism as an unnecessary concession to time and circumstance. Their goal is to transcend, rather than manage, the status quo. Akhenaten, Joan of Arc, Robespierre, Lenin and Gandhi are among the prophetic leaders of history. The dividing line between the two modes may appear absolute, but it is hardly impermeable. Leaders can pass from one mode to the other, or borrow from one while largely inhabiting the ways of the other. Churchill in his Wilderness Years and de Gaulle as leader of the Free French belonged, for these phases of their lives, in the prophetic category, as did Sadat after 1973. In practice, each of the 6 leaders profiled in this book managed a synthesis of the two tendencies, though with a tilt toward the statesmanlike. For the ancients, an optimal blend of the two styles was exemplified in the leadership of Themistocles, the Athenian leader who saved the Greek city-states from being absorbed by the Persian Empire. Thucydides described Themistocles as being, at once the best judge in those sudden crises which admit of little or no deliberation, and the best prophet of the future, even to its most distant possibilities. The encounter between the two modes is often inconclusive and frustrating, resulting from their distinctive measures of success. The test of statesmen is the durability of political structures under stress, while prophets gauge their achievements against absolute standards. If the statesman assesses possible courses of action on the basis of their utility rather than their truth, the prophet regards this approach as sacrilege, a triumph of expediency over universal principle. To the statesman, negotiation is a mechanism of stability. To the prophet, it can be a means of converting or demoralizing opponents. And if, to the statesman, preservation of the international order transcends any dispute within it, prophets are guided by their objective and willing to overturn the existing order. Both modes of leadership have been transformational, especially in periods of crisis, though the prophetic style, representative of moments of exaltation, will usually involve greater dislocation and suffering. Each approach also has its nemesis. The statesman's is that equilibrium, though it may be the condition of stability and of long-term progress, does not supply its own momentum. For the prophet, the risk is that an ecstatic mood may submerge humanity in the vastness of a vision and reduce the individual to an object. The individual in history. Whatever their personal characteristics or modes of action, leaders inevitably confront an unrelenting challenge, preventing the demands of the present from overwhelming the future. Ordinary leaders seek to manage the immediate, great ones attempt to raise their society to their visions. How to meet this challenge has been debated as long as humanity has considered the relationship between the willed and the inevitable. In the Western world since the 19th century, the solution was increasingly ascribed to history as if events overwhelmed men and women by a vast process of which they were tools, not creators. In the 20th century, numerous scholars, such as the eminent French historian Fernand Braudel, have insisted on viewing individuals and the events they shape as mere surface disturbances and crests of foam in a wider sea of vast and ineluctable tides. Leading thinkers, social historians, political philosophers, and international relations theorists alike have imbued inchoate forces with the strength of destiny. Before movements, structures, and distributions of power, one is told, humanity is denied all choice, and, by extension, cannot but abdicate all responsibility. These are, of course, valid concepts of historical analysis, and any leader must be conscious of their force. But they are always applied through human agency and filtered through human perception. Ironically, there has been no more efficient tool for the malign consolidation of power by individuals than theories of the inevitable laws of history. The issue this presents is whether these forces are endemic or subject to social and political action. Physics has learned that reality is altered by the process of observation. History similarly teaches that men and women shape their environment by their interpretation of it. Do individuals matter in history? A contemporary of Caesar or Muhammad, Luther or Gandhi, Churchill or FDR would hardly think of posing such a question. These pages deal with leaders who, in the unending contest between the willed and the inevitable, understood that what seems inevitable becomes so by human agency. They mattered because they transcended the circumstances they inherited and thereby carried their societies to the frontiers of the possible. Leadership, 6 Studies in World Strategy. By Henry Kissinger. 1. Konrad Adenauer, The Strategy of Humility. A. The Necessity of Renewal. B. From Early Life to Internal Exile. C. The Road to Leadership. D. The Restoration of Civil Order and the Inauguration of the Chancellor. E. The Path to a New National Identity. F. The Soviet Challenge and Rearmament. G. The Inextricable Past, Reparations to the Jewish People. H. 2 Crises, Suez and Berlin. I. 3 Conversations with Adenauer. J. German Unification, The Tormenting Weight. K. Final Conversations. L. The Adenauer Tradition. 1. Konrad Adenauer, The Strategy of Humility. The Necessity of Renewal. In January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, the Allies proclaimed that they would accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the driving force behind the announcement, sought to deprive any successor government to Hitler of the ability to claim that it had been deluded into surrender by unfulfilled promises. Germany's complete military defeat, together with its total loss of moral and international legitimacy, led inexorably to the progressive disintegration of the German civil structure. I observed this process as part of the 84th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army as it moved from the German border, near the industrial Ruhr territory, to the Elbe River near Magdeburg, just 100 miles away from the then-raging Battle of Berlin. As the division was crossing the German border, I was transferred to a unit responsible for security and prevention of the guerrilla activity that Hitler had ordered. For a person like me, whose family had fled the small Bavarian city of Fürth 6 years earlier to escape racial persecution, no greater contrast with the Germany of my youth could have been imagined. Then, Hitler had just annexed Austria and was in the process of dismembering Czechoslovakia. The dominant attitude of the German people verged on the overbearing. Now, white sheets hung from many windows to signify the surrender of the population. The Germans, who a few years earlier had celebrated the prospect of dominating Europe from the English Channel to the Volga River, were cowed and bewildered. Thousands of displaced persons, deported from Eastern Europe as forced labor during the war, crowded the streets in quest of food and shelter and the possibility of returning home. It was a desperate period in German history. Food shortages were severe. Many starved, and infant mortality was twice that of the rest of Western Europe. The established exchange of goods and services collapsed. Black markets took its place. Mail service ranged from impaired to non-existent. Rail service was sporadic and transport by road made extremely difficult by the ravages of war and the shortage of gasoline. In the spring of 1945, the task of occupying forces was to institute some kind of civil order until trained military government personnel could replace combat troops. This occurred around the time of the Potsdam Conference in July and August, of Churchill/Attlee, Truman, and Stalin. At that summit, the Allies divided Germany into 4 occupation zones: for the United States, a southern portion containing Bavaria; for Britain, the industrial northern Rhineland and Ruhr Valley; for France, the southern Rhineland and territory along the Alsatian border; and for the Soviets, a zone running from the Elbe River to the Oder-Neisse line, which formed the new Polish frontier, reducing pre-war German territory by nearly a quarter. The 3 western zones were each placed under the jurisdiction of a senior official of the occupying powers with the title of High Commissioner. German civil governance, once demonstrably efficient and unchallengeable, had come to an end. Ultimate authority was now exercised by occupation forces down to the county, Kreis, level. These forces maintained order, but it took the better part of 18 months for communications to be restored to predictable levels. During the winter of 1945-6, fuel shortages obliged even Konrad Adenauer, who was to become Chancellor 4 years later, to sleep in a heavy overcoat. Occupied Germany carried not only the burden of its immediate past but also of the complexity of its history. In the 74 years since unification, Germany had been governed successively as a monarchy, a republic, and a totalitarian state. By the end of the war, the only memory of stable governance harked back to unified Germany's beginning, under the chancellorship of Otto von Bismarck, 1871–90. From then until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the German Empire was hounded by what Bismarck would call the nightmare of hostile external coalitions provoked into existence by Germany's military potential and intransigent rhetoric. Because unified Germany was stronger than any of the many states surrounding it and more populous than any save Russia, its growing and potentially dominant power turned into the permanent security challenge of Europe. After the First World War, the newly established Weimar Republic was impoverished by inflation and economic crises and considered itself abused by the punitive provisions included in the post-war Treaty of Versailles. Under Hitler after 1933, Germany sought to impose its totalitarianism on all of Europe. In short, throughout the first half of the 20th century, United Germany had been by turns either too strong or too weak for the peace of Europe. By 1945, it had been reduced to its least secure position in Europe and the world since unification. The task of restoring dignity and legitimacy to this crushed society fell to Konrad Adenauer, who had served as Lord Mayor, Oberbürgermeister, of Cologne for 16 years before being dismissed by Hitler. Adenauer was by his background fortuitously cast for a role that required at once the humility to administer the consequences of unconditional surrender and the strength of character to regain an international standing for his country among the democracies. Born in 1876, only 5 years after German unification under Bismarck, Adenauer was for the rest of his life associated with his native city of Cologne, with its towering Gothic cathedral overlooking the Rhine and its history as an important locus in the Hanseatic constellation of mercantile city-states. As an adult, Adenauer had experienced the unified German state's 3 post-Bismarck configurations, its truculence under the Kaiser, domestic upheavals under the Weimar Republic, and adventurism under Hitler, culminating in self-destruction and disintegration. In striving to remake a place for his country in a legitimate post-war order, he faced a legacy of global resentment and, at home, the disorientation of a public battered by the long sequence of revolution, world war, genocide, defeat, partition, economic collapse and loss of moral integrity. He chose a course both humble and daring, to confess German iniquities, accept the penalties of defeat and impotence, including the partition of his country, allow the dismantling of its industrial base as war reparations, and seek through submission to build a new European structure within which Germany could become a trusted partner. Germany, he hoped, would become a normal country, though always, he knew, with an abnormal memory. From early life to internal exile. Adenauer's father, Johann, once a non-commissioned officer in the Prussian army, was for 3 decades a clerical civil servant in Cologne. Lacking education beyond mandatory primary school, Johann was determined to provide his children with educational and career opportunities. Adenauer's mother shared this objective. The daughter of a bank clerk, she supplemented Johann's income through needlework. Together, they assiduously prepared young Konrad for school and strove to transmit their Catholic values to him. Cognizance of sin and social responsibility ran as an undercurrent throughout Adenauer's childhood. As a student at the University of Bonn, he achieved a reputation for commitment through his habit of plunging his feet into a bucket of ice water to overcome the fatigue of late-night studies. Adenauer's degree in law and family background of service induced him to join the Cologne Civil Service in 1904. He was given the title of Beigeordnieter, or assistant mayor, with particular responsibility for taxation. In 1909, he was promoted to senior deputy mayor and in 1917 became Lord Mayor of Cologne. Mayors of Cologne were typically former civil servants who strove to elevate their conduct above the violent and intensely partisan politics of the era. Adenauer's reputation grew to the extent that, in 1926, There were even discussions in Berlin as to whether he might be drafted as Chancellor of a national unity government. The effort fell apart because of the difficulty of finding a nonpartisan alliance. Adenauer's condition for accepting the position. Adenauer's first conspicuous national conduct occurred in connection with Hitler's designation as Chancellor on January 30, 1933. To fortify his position, Hitler called a general election and proposed to the German parliament the so-called Enabling Act, suspending the rule of law and the independence of civil institutions. Adenauer, in the month after Hitler's designation as Chancellor, undertook 3 public demonstrations of opposition. In the Prussian Upper House, to which he belonged ex officio as Lord Mayor of Cologne, he voted against the Enabling Act. He refused an invitation to welcome Hitler at Cologne Airport during the election campaign. And in the week before the election he ordered the removal of Nazi flags from bridges and other public monuments. Adenauer was dismissed from office the week after Hitler's foreordained electoral victory. After his dismissal, Adenauer appealed for sanctuary to an old school friend who had become the abbot of a Benedictine monastery. It was granted, and in April Adenauer took up residence in Maria Loch Abbey, 50 miles south of Cologne on the Lacher See. There, his main occupation was to immerse himself in 2 papal encyclicals, promulgated by Popes Leo XIII and Pius XI, which applied Catholic teaching to social and political developments, especially the evolving condition of the modern working class. In these encyclicals, Adenauer encountered doctrines that meshed with his political convictions, emphasizing Christian rather than political identity, condemning communism and socialism, ameliorating class struggle through humility and Christian charity, and ensuring free competition instead of cartel practices. Adenauer's time at Maria Loch was not to last. While attending a Christmas Mass, which had drawn people from the surrounding area to see and support him, Nazi officials pressured the abbot to evict his admired guest. Adenauer left the following January. The next decade of his life brought difficulty and instability. There were moments of grave danger, especially after the unsuccessful plot on Hitler's life in July 1944 organized by representatives of the Prussian upper class, and including remnants of pre-Nazi political and military life. Hitler's vengeance sought to destroy all these elements. For a while, Adenauer escaped their fate by traveling peripatetically, never staying in one place for more than 24 hours. Danger never altered his rejection of Hitler for trampling on the rule of law, which Adenauer considered to be the sine qua non of the modern state. Although a known dissenter, Adenauer had been unwilling to join with anti-regime conspirators, whether civilian or military, largely because he was skeptical of their possibilities of success. On the whole, as one scholar describes it, he and his family did their best to live as quietly and inconspicuously as possible. Despite his departure from politics, the Nazis eventually imprisoned him. In fall 1944, he spent 2 months in a prison cell from the window of which he witnessed executions, including that of a 16-year-old boy. Above him he heard the screams of other inmates as they were tortured. In the end, his son Max, who was serving in the German army, managed to secure his release. As American tanks entered the Rhineland in February 1945, Adenauer began to think about whether he might find a role in his militarily defeated, morally devastated, economically reeling, and politically collapsed country. The road to leadership. Hitler's savage reaction to the July coup, in the frenzied final year of the Second World War, had decimated the ranks of those who might try to succeed him. Some senior Social Democratic Party politicians had survived the concentration camps, including Adenauer's later rival Kurt Schumacher, and possessed the political stature for the position of chancellor. But they lacked followings large enough to win the public support needed to implement the country's unconditional surrender, and its accompanying penalties, preconditions for gaining the confidence of the Western Allies. In May 1945, the American forces that first occupied Cologne reinstated Adenauer as mayor, but with the transfer of the city to British authority as a result of the Potsdam Agreement, tensions arose, and the British dismissed him within a few months. Though he was temporarily excluded from political activity by the occupying power, Adenauer quietly concentrated on building a political base in preparation for the re-emergence of German self-government. In December 1945, Adenauer attended a meeting to form a new party influenced by both Catholic and Protestant Christianity. Former members of the Catholic Centre Party, with which Adenauer had been associated as mayor of Cologne, as well as of the conservative German National People's Party and the liberal German Democratic Party, were in attendance. Many had opposed Hitler, and some had been imprisoned for their resistance. The group lacked a clear political direction and doctrine. Indeed, the tone of discussions at this initial meeting was more socialist than classically liberal. In part because of Adenauer's objections, the question of first principles was put aside, and the group simply settled on its name, the Christian Democratic Union. The following month, Adenauer helped to imbue the CDU with its political philosophy as the party of democracy, social conservatism and European integration, rejecting Germany's recent past as well as totalitarianism in any form. At a January 1946 Congress of the CDU's important members in the British occupation zone in Herford, Westphalia, Adenauer elaborated on these principles and consolidated his leadership of the nascent party. Adenauer's first public speech after the end of the war on March 26, 1946, was a preview of his subsequent political leadership. Criticizing Germany's conduct under Hitler, Adenauer asked an audience of thousands in the severely damaged main hall of the University of Cologne how it was possible that the Nazis had come to power. They had then committed great crimes, he said, and the Germans could find their way toward a better future only by coming to terms with their past. Such an effort would be necessary for their country's revival. From this perspective, Germany's attitude after the Second World War needed to be the opposite of its reaction to the First. Instead of indulging in self-pitying nationalism once again, Germany should seek its future within a unifying Europe. Adenauer was proclaiming a strategy of humility. Tall and seemingly imperturbable, Adenauer tended to speak tersely, though mitigated by the lilting tones of the Rhineland, more conciliatory than Prussian speech, in which, according to Mark Twain,